Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Thanks for being here. Pathwise is thrilled to be partnered with School Bus Fleet today for this session. We've been really looking forward to this discussion today and think it'll be very informative and thought-provoking for everyone listening. Before we get started here, just a couple of housekeeping notes. I'd like to go over how you guys in the audience can participate with us in today's session. So everybody is in listen-only mode, but if you have a question that you'd like to ask at any point during the discussion, you can use your dedicated Q&A box to enter your question, and we will be sure to answer it either during the discussion or at the end during the designated Q&A session. We will also have a couple of poll questions throughout the presentation, so please be sure to engage with those and answer when prompted. Lastly, tomorrow we will be sending out the link to the recording. So please be sure to watch your emails just in case you might want to share with a colleague who might not have been able to join us today. I think that wraps up everything that I have. So I will go ahead and pass it off to our moderator, Tammy Cook.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to have you here today. Welcome to the webinar. I'm Tammy Cook. I'm the Senior Transportation Advisor at Pathwise and the Easy Routing product. I've been working with K-12 schools and school transportation software for over 25 years and excited to be here with you for this topic today. I did want to give you just a little bit of background on Pathwise. So Pathwise, as many of you know, is the creator of the Easy Routing Transportation Suite. And we've worked with K-12 districts for over 30 years, really just helping districts and transportation departments become more efficient. So many ways our team is experienced on all aspects of transportation. And one of the things that sets us apart is that many of our staff are former school personnel. We would also like to thank School Bus Fleet, who helps teams run safer, more efficiently, and stay connected to trends shaping the future of K-12 transportation, much like this topic we're discussing today. With me today, I'm excited to have both Tim Ammon and Jim Beekman joining us as our speakers. Both of these men are experts in their field. Tim Ammon is the owner of Ammon Consulting Group and has been supporting transportation and fleet operations for more than 25 years, super experienced. He's consistently focused on really evaluating and identifying opportunities to improve operational performance across transportation departments, helping folks to adopt processes, improvements, technology, and personnel practices across their organizations. Jim Beekman is a transportation and operations expert with more than 40 years of experience in leadership in K-12 student mobility. He was former general manager of transportation at Hillsborough County Schools. Many of you know Jim. He oversaw a huge fleet of vehicles, and he's just got a tremendous amount of experience in helping districts become more efficient as well. So we're really excited to have such tremendous experience today as we talk about something that's happening in districts nationwide right now, which is school closures. We're going to make the case that transportation really should be at the table before the vote and not scrambling after it. Tim, I'm going to start with you. School closures are obviously not something new, but you and Jim both have seen this trend really accelerating. Before we get into the tools and the data, can you set the stage for us? Like, why is it important for the pre-decision moment in K-12 so critical for transportation leaders?
Thanks, Tammy. I think what we have seen in virtually every state, but in particular in a lot of northeastern states and a lot of states in the upper Northwest, we've seen this migratory pattern of students moving. And so as a consequence, what has happened is that coupled with some of the other major sort of demographic changes around the country, including really significantly changed birth rates and so forth. Since 2014, we've had about a 2% reduction in the total number of students enrolled in public schools. And now some of that is a combination of both of birth rates, some of that is a combination of students going to other kinds of schools that may be charter, maybe parochial, some other kind of private school. But But the net effect of it is that there are fewer kids. And so as a consequence of having fewer kids, what we end up with is the need for fewer buildings. In addition to that, what we have seen is the inventory of facilities around the country has aged pretty rapidly. Recent reports from Council of Facilities Managers has demonstrated the change in the net number of facilities around the country. And one of the things that we see is in a period from about 2015-ish school year to about the 2023 school year, we've had more than 10,000 school closings across the country. And approximately 8,000 of those have been in public school buildings. So 80% of the total, which is significant. And when we have about 100,000 schools across the U.S., that's about a 1% a year closure rate. And so it's not inconsequential what's going on. And what we see is the change in that is really driving a lot of considerations from a transportation perspective. Once we've looked at where facilities are supposed to go, the big question is, how are we supposed to get kids there? I mean, the idea that transportation is at the end of this chain is always problematic because it has such an enormous influence on what is the cost profile of any decision around school closure. And one of the things that, if we take a fairly typical 500 student elementary school, Jebediah Springfield Elementary School for all the Simpsons fans out there, if we're going to close that school, we have to figure out where those 500 kids are going. And the question is, are they going to a neighboring school? Are they going to a couple of neighboring schools? Are we sprinkling them across the district? All of those things have very different influences on transportation and its ultimate impact. And so what we would argue, certainly, and what we would encourage anybody in the transportation space to be thinking about is being able to articulate and being able to reference how these kinds of closures have the ripple effect through the routing network and through bell times and through everything else that becomes really consequential once we do try to make this decision, which is incredibly difficult for communities to make, which is emotionally invested everywhere that it goes. What we are really trying to achieve here from a win perspective, right, is it may not be sort of big changes in efficiency. It may be limiting the damage that a school closure does to the effectiveness of our existing routing network. And so I think trying to understand the difference between mitigation, remediation, and some kind of benefit, transportation folks can be an enormously valuable voice in that conversation when it comes to school closures.
Oh, thank you, Tim. That's a great perspective on that. There are so many aspects to this, and I appreciate you setting the stage for us on this issue. Now, Jim, you've been at the table in planning for Hillsborough, Orange, and Osceola districts. What really does it look like when transportation is actually in the room during those early conversations?
Well, it allows us to get ahead of the game. And so one of the issues, and Tim said it so eloquently, that we talk about school closures. School closure is tough. And so it's hard on the superintendent, it's hard on the school board, because the community usually has historical ties to that. The parents went to that school, the grandparents, there's a long group of family members and community that fed that school, and all of a sudden now we have to look at a closure simply because there's not enough kids in that surrounding area. Population's moving out, maybe, as Tim had alluded to, going to different type of schools, charter schools, and some other things such as that. So the board needs our picture, right? And so every decision that the school board makes, there's typically three types of return on investment. As transportation, we look at data, we look at costs, we look at all the efficiencies. We really try to look at the return on investment. So if we're investing into a product, into a process, or into anything else, we say, here is the cost savings. Sometimes it may not be a cost savings, sometimes it's a cost avoidance. And so we look at that. The board looks at it in a different perspective because there's an educational return on investment. And so in some cases, this is, as Tim said, a win for the district, is that transportation costs may escalate while overall district costs are maintained or curtailed, or some level of savings there. So you may see that. Transportation needs to be at the table to explain that. Because when it's presented to the board, we don't want any surprises. We don't want the board to come back and say, oh my gosh, I didn't know it was going to cost us an extra $500,000 in transportation costs. They need to know that up front if that's a cost. Some cases in those closings, it might be if you get at the table quick enough, you may be able to maintain or even reduce costs because you can consolidate some routes and do some different things that's going on. But we should never have to wait to be told. We should know what our student counts are. And I know visiting a lot of districts across the country, there are some districts that don't look at student counts on buses because their funding mechanism, there's no requirement to do so. In the state of Florida, it's different. In some other states, it's different because it's based on student ridership, not student, whether they're eligibility. So if they're eligible, then some districts are funded based on eligibility rates. So we could always see the population going down from a bus perspective. It takes away from the cars and the walkers and everything else. But typically, it works out that if the bus ridership is dwindling, then so is cars and so are walking and everything else. So transportation should never be surprised. Matter of fact, hand in hand, they'll be one of the first outside groups that recognize. Of course, your principal and the classroom, all those things, when they look at 5-day, 20-day, and all their FTE counts and things such as that, they'll look at those numbers. But as far as from the outside looking in, typically it's transportation that should already be seeing that information. So, to me, it's always important to have a seat at the table to give them our perspective and then our ideas. Transportation directors are amazing magicians. Year after year, they do more with less, and they pull rabbits out of hats to make things work. For those that are transportation directors out there, be proud of that fact. Even though it's sometimes you feel like you're managing chaos, but it equips you for these type of scenarios to go in and make sure your voice is heard sitting at the table, because you're going to be part of the solution. And you're either going to be part of it as a participant, or you're going to be a spectator and say, here's the plan. They're going to say, here's the plan, make it happen. So.
Yeah, I love that, Jim. We definitely, as transportation folks, want to be at the table, right? And we want to be not just spectators, right? So I think your point there is to get out ahead of this, one, both in the data trends, recognizing that, and getting your voice out in that conversation early on. So Tim, let's get practical with this. What are some things that a transportation can actually do with our routing tools right now before closure votes or even discussion happens?
I think it starts with the idea of understanding the characteristics of two populations. From a transportation perspective, a lot of times what we think about is, not surprisingly, the kids we transport. And that's certainly a useful and necessary thing. But what we know in most instances is about all the kids who are going to a school. And one of the things that we find to be frequently useful is this idea of saying, wait a minute, let's look at where the kids are coming from that are going to any particular school. And if what we have is some aspect of 20% of the kids who are going to a particular school are from outside of the boundary, that could very well be an indicator that, hey, this is a school that's being frankly propped up by virtue of bringing in programs or whatever it might be, because we either haven't wanted to or haven't been able to close this school for whatever reason. But it's clearly going to be on a list, because if we've got a school with a 500 student capacity that has 150 kids in their enrollment boundary, it is pretty unlikely that we're going to be able to support that in the long term, right? So starting with this idea of what's the total population of kids going to an individual school, and how does that compare to how many kids should be kind of quote going to that school? And then looking at it from a transportation perspective, if we transport 80% of those kids, understanding from a closure perspective the impact on three things that people are going to care about a lot. The first thing is being able to look at, from a distribution standpoint, if I've got 500 kids going to one neighboring school, what's the impact on things like ride time, for example, because ultimately that's what people will care about. The second thing will be just the net number of new riders that we might be creating, because now all of a sudden that we've closed the boundary and kids may be further from their destination school, we've changed the net number of riders probably that we have to be able to get there. And so we have a question of, do we have a proper number of seats to be able to do that, or are we going to have to bring in additional resources for it? And if we know those two things, if we know the change in the number of riders and some approximation of what the ride time changes are going to be, we get down into the really granular place, which is little Timmy going to have to go to a different bus stop, which is going to make the world stop and people freak out, right? And so being able to be an active and useful participant from an administrative and a leadership perspective in those conversations to district leadership, to district administrators, to be able to say, here's what we think is going to happen, is ultimately, I think, the most valuable role that transportation can provide, because to Jim's point, you're either a participant or a victim, and it's a lot better if you're a participant. And so, being able to use the tools that you have, being able to look at the distribution of kids across the map, and being able to look at possible scenarios from a route consolidation or a route expansion perspective, I think ultimately is the baseline way to be able to use tools like easy routing to think about this question of what is the impact on critical values of either closing, consolidating, or revising the grades at a particular school.
Yeah, that's great advice. We need to be in the numbers. We need to be in the data, understand the potential impacts of that, and be ahead of the game. I appreciate that. And before we continue on, though, I would like to take a poll from our audience and see, at what stage your transportation department is typically brought into school closure discussions. So we're going to bring that poll up. And the options are before any decisions are made, during the planning process, but after initial decisions, after the board vote, or were rarely or never consulted. So we're going to give everybody a moment. That should be popping up on your screen to see. Okay. Give everybody just a moment. Okay, so right now it looks like we're in a great place, that we have most everybody's before the decision is made. So that's great. You guys are in a great place if that's the case. So we're going to move on just a little bit further and just talk about maybe some ways that we can help you in that discussion. So we're going to talk about the transportation impact statements. Jim, let's head back to you, and let's say a closure is being considered. Transportation's at the table. What does a real transportation impact statement look like? And what are the non-negotiable data points that the boards need to see in this discussion?
Well, one of the things I always did, and I would recommend it, is get your data together and have it together all the time. Countless times I've gotten contacted by the COO or even the superintendent's office and say, hey, I've got the media wants to know this, or a board member wants to know this. Can you get me a quick bit of data or what it may look like by lunchtime today? And so we're always behind that. And so as Tim had spoken to as well, that data piece is really key on that. And so We should always anticipate things ahead of time and have those data points readily available. If you don't have any type of sophisticated system, it's going to take you forever to get it. Even with a sophisticated routing system platform, you still need time to do different scenarios, because in every piece, they're going to want to know how does it affect bell times. Our job is to get kids there safely and get them on time, okay? And so when we look at KPIs like on-time arrival, how do these decisions affect that on-time arrival? Because some of those pieces that they're asking for, you may need to go back, and it may not necessarily be a bad thing, and say, look, we can pull this off, but we need an extra 15 minutes somewhere in order for those geographic distances, so we can ensure that kids are to school on time, and they're in classroom on time, and things such as that, especially for high school students. High school students that are in advanced classes and things, if they miss the first 15 minutes of class every day, they're behind. And so transportation never wants to be in the position to say, hey, if you're a bus rider, you're going to end up losing valuable class time to help you to your next level, whatever that is. You also have to look at the data impact as far as what is on the table and what's not on the table. Many districts double run in order to get some of these happening because of the shortage of bus drivers. Is the district primarily mirrored routes? That means where the first run and the afternoon run, they're identical drivers, identical routes. They pick them up in the morning, then they take them right back. A lot of districts now have gone to non-mirrored routes, where it's a different driver in the afternoon, different driver in the morning, simply because of the geographics and where they're going, and they see it. And sometimes it's because of non-contiguous zones. So you look at, as they look at closures, it's imperative that districts look at contiguous zones for consistency, because otherwise you're going to be forced into non-mirrored routes and some other things. And then the other piece is the human resource component. When we talk about the impact and what the impact is going to be on transportation, it's simple to say we need 4 more drivers. Reality is, where do they come from? How do we get them? Whether it's 4, 40, or what that is. There's also personnel impacts that's beyond just thinking about school buses, because if we extend our day, if we have to extend different areas, you have dispatch, you have shift. So you look at shift changes, they can trigger union, HR complaints, board calls, seniority disputes. I'm a more senior person, I need to come at this time versus that time. Everything that goes into, and especially even on the fleet side, that impacts that movement of bell times, movement of zones, a closure of a school, anything like that, needs to be outlined so that the board has the complete picture. We talked about that earlier. They need to know everything with no surprises and what those impacts. So when they make an impact statement, they not only need to look at those pieces that are effectively the bus routes and the students, but every part of your organization that may either have some sort of impact to it. Because not all those impacts are bad. Some of those impacts can be good. However, they still need to be identified and brought out into that statement.
So it sounds like, Jim, in order to be ready to be at the table early in the game, folks need to be looking at this data, right? And understanding how they gather that early on there. Would you agree with that?
Yes. I've always, I always started my day with my staff. I always said, I hope you brought your A game today because we need it. And they'll say, well, you said that yesterday. I said, well, we needed it yesterday, and get ready. We're going to need it tomorrow as well, because we need to be in a position of being part of a solution not being part of the problem. And so it takes that type of effort every single day to do that.
Yeah, I agree. Tim, I do think sometimes it's easy for us to underestimate when we build these impact statements. What do you think is the area that most folks underestimate the effort in this?
It's tricky because I think it crosses a bunch of different boundaries that transportation managers have to deal with. I think in many cases, the place where we start to underestimate is actually going to be on the cost impact. And I think it's sort of a weird psychological connection, which is where if we think we're reducing schools, and I don't know that if this is a transportation psychology question or just a general psychology question, right? But we think we're reducing schools, so there should be some automatic reduction in cost, right? Like people just assume that that's going to be the case. And what we know from transportation work is that relationship, actually reduced schools, can have, in many cases, an inverse relationship to cost, is that we may end up with cost increases. And so to Jim's point, the idea of having some available information ready so that you can make quick estimates, on a cost per bus basis or a cost per mile basis or whatever it might be, your sort of chosen metric of the day, I think is really important to understand, because what we know is that there are a bunch of things that are going to come up that are going to present as a challenge. So, for example, when we decide to close a school, one of the things that transportation needs to be highly invested in is what programs are in that school now and where are they going to go? Because the disproportionate cost, particularly for special needs students, for example, if now all of a sudden we have a relatively centralized program within a district that's now being distributed out to, the northwest corner of the district, we may be hauling kids from all over hither and yon, and all of the connections that we've made from a routing perspective may now break. And the consequence of that is actually potentially a fairly severe net cost increase, which means if we can surface that early enough and we have options relative to the facility we might be thinking about closing, we have a chance to arrest what that cost increase might be before we ever sort of get into the confessional aspect of this thing on the public stage, right? So I think that's part of what we need to be thinking about, because the component of this that is oftentimes left out. We are good in transportation talking about expenditures. We know how much it costs us on a per bus basis. We know how much it costs us on a per mile basis. What we know a lot less about, and certainly we talk a lot less about, is the revenue side and what the impact is, because none of this starts from zero, and none of this is solely on an expenditure reduction or increase basis. What we need to be thinking about is what the net cost difference is. So net cost from what we're spending right now, and net cost on, if we do this, what does it do to the cost side of the house, but what does it also do to the revenue side of the house? So for example, if we've got we're in a state where there is some reimbursement on a per vehicle basis based on ridership, and all of a sudden we've got 4 relatively lightly used assets that we get reimbursement for each of the riders on, and we can consolidate that down now into 3 vehicles. We've got arguably the same amount of revenue at a reduced cost of 1 vehicle. So from a net basis, we're much better off. And so the ability to understand not only how your costs work, but how your funding works makes you a much more valuable and a much more useful participant in the closure discussion, because you can model out what some of those net cost impacts are. That also gives us the opportunity to say, hey, one of the ways to mitigate some of these negative costs may be, as Jim pointed out earlier, looking at bell time changes. And if we're going to eat this elephant, do we want to eat the elephant, closing the school and making bell time changes at the same time so that everybody gets mad at us all at once and we don't have to spread this out over a bunch of years? Do we just want to take the hit now and get it done? And if we can do that and demonstrate that is part of a strategy to control any negative impacts on the overall cost of services, To me, that strikes me as sort of a responsible way to think about the transportation role within this whole process, in that your primary job isn't to decide on any of these things. Your primary job is to say, here are both the consequences and the implications of doing one thing over the other. And the only way to do that, I think, is to be prepared in the manner that Jim was talking about, which is know what it costs, know what you bring in, know what the implications are of particular changes, whether they are changes to distance or changes to capacity or whatever it might be. And thinking about it in terms of what is confronting districts right now. One of the challenges certainly that we're seeing are really severe issues around capital replacement, around the replacement of buses, as a lot of the grant funding that was funding replacements is going away. One of the things that we may be able to assess is to say, hey, if we do this, it means we can take 4 buses out of the fleet, which is 4 more buses that we don't have to replace, which is a $500,000 cost avoidance, which Jim was talking about earlier, right? That $500,000 cost avoidance is real money saved in the future. And so the more of those kinds of things you can bring to the table, I think the more that folks will listen to transportation in terms of decisions related to what makes the most sense from a closure perspective.
That's good. Looking at it even down the road, longer term, with cost avoidance, that's huge, right? Because that's big dollars when you're talking about replacing buses. So, Jim, I did want to get your perspective a little bit, particularly as it comes to bell times. That can be such a sensitive area for parents in the community. But can you give your perspective on the timing of that?
Yeah, I think Tim had touched on that, and he's right. I used to work for a guy that said, look, says never let a catastrophe block the way of something good, because many times when we get these mandates of changing something in transportation from the district level or moving programs and things that has a strenuous impact on staff, we say, oh my gosh, what a catastrophe. But you look for the silver lining, and sometimes that silver lining might be bell times. And for those who are listening in, has ever gone through a massive bell time change, I will share with you, it is not fun. I liked how Tim said, get everybody mad at you all at the same time. It's like ripping the Band-Aid off. I know that when I was in Hillsborough County, we changed all our bell times. And on top of changing all the bell times, we put the elementary kids first. And at that time, we were transporting 86,000 kids a day. So had a lot of people mad. And it was I wish we had done it before social media, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. And so you have to take those licks and everything else. But the benefit was to the kids, because we didn't have enough time geographically to get the kids to and from school, and they were consistently late. So again, if this presents itself, look at those issues within transportation. Just like Tim had said, cost avoidance. If you can downsize your fleet, that's a positive impact everywhere. On your budget, because if you keep them in as spares, you have to inspect them. Your fleet guys have to touch them. Everything. So if you can reduce fleet, if you can change bell times to give yourself a position of strength within the district. And I think it's important to note, when you go through these processes, the goal isn't for transportation to win. This is not, hey, we won this argument or we won this or whatever. But the goal is the entire district winning, right? And so when we frame it that way, what it does for transportation directors, it does not only give them a seat at the table, they earn the seat at the table, and they keep the seat at the table because they come in as solution providers versus, oh my gosh, what are you doing to me now? The victim mentality that Tim had mentioned earlier. So but take advantage when these things are presented to transportation and say, look, we have to look at it holistically. It's not a one little item of a school. How does this affect, and how can we gain and make it better for the entire district as a whole when these things happen?
Yeah, I agree with that. That's so important that we come in as collaborators in this and come at it from a district-wide standpoint. I liked what you said about the bell times and we have to get the students to school on time. And so even they're communicating with parents and stakeholders that if we have to make a bell time change, it's for that reason. I think sometimes we just forget to communicate that out to our stakeholders and our parents, that there's the end game behind this is really that kids get to school on time. So appreciate that. All right, we're going to take just a moment, get a poll from our audience, and we're asking, which element of transportation impact statement do you find the hardest to quantify for your board? And these are all some hard ones, really. Travel time, increases by route or geography, a net cost versus gross cost, driver and personnel impacts, and bell time ripple effects. So I wanted to give everybody just a moment to answer the survey on that, and give it just a moment, and then we'll give you guys some of the impact of that. Okay, I think everybody's finding these equally hard to quantify. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some tools to help with that too a little bit later. All right, so let's get into redistricting. Jim, when attendance boundaries are being drawn, transportation really has a unique ability to model what those boundaries actually mean in practice, because transportation is so highly affected by that. How do modern routing tools change this conversation for us?
Well, modern routing systems that's tied directly to SIS, it just makes it the modeling possible. Back in the day, it was guesswork. And I mean, we were patching up systems. We were trying to capture numbers off of mapping systems and things such as that. The advent of the computerized routing has helped. We've actually taken those into districting meetings, where they have parents inside the district meetings, and when they pull up scenarios, because they're looking at numbers and balance of numbers, we could actually pull it up and do it right there in front of them, and they're amazed. And it adds credibility to the process, right? Because sometimes they think, oh, you're just making these numbers up and whatever. But when we can actually pull it up, and we can actually, they'll say, show me my house and where's my child, and we can pull them up, and they see that data is correct on their own child, and then it adds credibility. I mean, the goal is to maintain, for a district, the district tries to maintain a balance of demographics, not only numbers. So it's a very delicate piece of work, because not only is it the demographics, but it's actually the classroom numbers. You don't want a school that's overloaded with third graders. You want to make sure that, as you're moving and you build your fifth grade, as they move into the middle school at sixth grade, if they're going into that, or from eighth grade to ninth grade, that feeder school is not overbalancing the school that it's going to as well. So it's not just that school or that community, it affects a wide range of pieces, and so that allows us to do it. So when we run, it allows us to run those multiple boundary scenarios, and it allows us to balance ridership and feasibility. And then the data, I would like to say, I wish I could say that data drives the decision, but it impacts the decision. I think that you'll always see that at some point in time, there's that human element and there's that political element that goes in. Because again, if you've been through a redistricting meeting, it's a very emotional process. I can still remember my first one in a board meeting, and a guy walked up from, it was a high school redistricting, and he walked up to the microphone, and all he said was, My daddy was a bulldog, I was a bulldog, and my boy is going to be a bulldog. And he turned around and he walked back. I mean, that was the tradition of that high school, and they wanted to be part of that. And it was crazy looking at some of the things that they did. But we've evolved, right? And so not only have we taken now systems that were patchwork. So we had a routing program, we had a GPS program, and we had some other safety programs. We had a fleet program, and we looked at all those type of programs. We interchanged flat files and just exchanged information because no one wanted to give up their secret sauce formula within their routing program and software pieces. But what we've seen now is the evolution of software that's coming out says we're a complete platform. And so when we look at that complete integration piece where tablets are integrated with student counts and GPS modeling and on-time arrival rates and everything else, and they're all working harmoniously together, I think it's even easier today to manage that difficult process of redistricting and give them the information that they need to make the right decision. So although it's not completely data driven, because it involves politicians, and I'll say that, but there is a human element to it, but it does afford people to see what the data looks like in almost an instant scenario. So it's been great bringing these systems in for that process.
Yeah, and I appreciate your explanation there. I know, particularly since our company works with routing software, just the ability that's been developed over the last few years to be able to see all of this data together, it really brings, to me, it elevates transportation in that discussion because of some of the visual aspects we have of routing to look at what it might look like maybe in a sandbox scenario. If you were to change the boundaries, how does that affect student counts and ridership and routing ahead of time, which is amazing that we can do that. I like your discussion along the lines of a single platform. It makes things so much easier for transportation to be able to gain access to that data without worrying so much about the technology behind it, but just being able to use the data that's there for them. So I think that's really, really important. Tim, what do you think's at stake for transportation if we're not part of the boundary drawing conversations up front?
I think the thing that's ultimately at stake is you have to live with it. And that may be the worst part of it. So I think what we have to recognize is that in most instances, nobody really wants to do this. In most instances, we're being put in a position where we have to do this. And so from a transportation standpoint, what you may not be looking for is a good answer. You may be looking for the best worst answer. And so ensuring that you can try to provide some input into that. And for example, being able to say to a demographer, hey, if we move kids from school B to school A, here's what the implications are. And if we move them to school C, it's better or worse, right? Mm-hmm. And at least allowing that to influence how we think about some of the things that you mentioned earlier, which is, hey, we're not going to have overcrowded third grades. We're not going to have buildings that, still remain at 60% of capacity. We can be in those conversations so that we can actually live with the answer, because I think what we have unfortunately seen too many times is when transportation's not involved in this decision and then things go poorly after the decision's been made, transportation gets blamed for the things going poorly when in the end it was put in a position to not succeed in the first place. And so trying to position ourselves for some kind of success to me is, I think, the most important thing that we can do, because the ultimate consequence is we're going to have to live with the decisions that have been made.
Yeah, Jim, I'd like to hear your comments on this as well. This is some great discussion in this area.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's important to have your voice heard. And like Tim said, there's going to be times, we state our opinion, we give the facts and everything else, and they say that's great information. We're not going to use your recommendations. And but I think for me, I always felt better that if I at least had to say whether it didn't go my way or not way, that it was a district-wide decision, and you have to have it. You have to have that voice, and so sometimes we document that. And so every position I ever had, I always followed up and said, "Here's our position," blah 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 blah. And if it ever comes back, like Tim said, sometimes transportation gets blamed, but we just kind of cover those tracks and go that direction. Vouchers, charter school growth, they're only going to increase the frequency of the decisions that we're facing right now. And so if you're not prepared, get prepared, because you're going to hit it. I know in the state of Florida now, one that's a huge impact is districts are facing, they have to close schools. The state legislator have come in and said, time out. If you've got extra space, we're going to allow charter schools to come in there and live in your space for free, and you can keep those schools open. So it forces districts to take a financial hit. So it's a huge battle in Florida. So the time that you have to plan for a closing of the school may be minimized in those circumstances. So it's probably more important now than ever to have all your data points and things together. You should always go into every school year and just thinking, about redistricting. Most districts have gone through that multiple times, and they're used to it, especially if they have a high growth. You also have the other flip side of that, where you have a high growth area and you have to split the schools. And so that redistricting is all part of that. So always go in there with that plan. But I think now what we've seen over the past few years, couple years, and primarily since COVID and the advent of charter schools accelerating and voucher systems, that school closures are going to only increase. And I think that's just another thing to put in your toolbox to sit and bring your staff together and say, how do we react? How are we going to plan for this? Let's get our numbers together. I know one of the things that I always did at the beginning of the year is I gave out in July, or end of July, 1st of August, because you're opening school, the media wants talking points. They don't want to hear from a director of transportation. They want to hear from school board members and superintendents. So for transportation, I gave them a cheat sheet, about 2 pages worth, and they had all of our KPIs on there. They had our cost per student, cost per bus. One of the things in Florida was the walking distance. I had what it would cost to transport every kid by half mile to the school, all the way up to right across the street, based on estimates, based on those costs and things. Anything I could imagine that the media would ask, I put in the hands of the school board. And so this is just another thing that you would put in their hands to understand the impact. When you start to see those low numbers, how many buses does it impact? Because they may say, well, this, and then the media may ask the question, how many buses does this impact? And it gives you an opportunity to give the board that information up front. It impacts 10 buses, and those buses are tied to, another 2 runs every day. So we ran our buses 3 runs a day. And so I think that it's just more important than ever to be in a position of strength. We've always been taught, work from a position of strength. Because if you don't, and when I say that, I mean, be prepared with your data, your numbers, and everything else, because if not, you're just going to sit there and not contribute and take whatever they give you. And so we want to be able to have that voice heard. So kind of my piece on it.
That's great. So what I'm hearing here, the big takeaways, I think, are be prepared, have your data accessible, know how to get to it, have the right tools, right? And sometimes if you're running on something that might not have the ability to do the kinds of things we're talking about today, it might be time to take a look at some of the things that are out in the market that can do that. And so that you can get the data that you need. You can come to the table, you can be proactive, you can be a partner in the discussion and not be reactive. So appreciate that. That's really good. And we're going to take one final poll before we go into the Q&A, and really to find out how confident folks are in their ability to use the current tools they have to model redistricting scenarios. If you would just take a moment to answer the survey. Are we either very confident, we do this regularly, somewhat confident, not very confident, or we haven't faced redistricting yet? So we'll give you guys just a moment to answer that. And just a reminder, as we go into the Q&A section, if you have any questions, certainly put those in for us, and we'll spend the last few minutes answering those questions. All right, so it seems like we got folks that are pretty confident in this. And so the thing I would say is if you're not, be looking at that, be preparing, be thinking ahead, because inevitably from the discussion we've had with Tim and Jim, this is going to come your way if it hasn't already, right? We're seeing a lot of movement in this. And so you want to make sure that you're able to come to the table prepared as a collaborator in this conversation. So, all right, we're going to take it into the Q&A session. So we're going to take a look at the questions that we've got. And Tim and Jim, I'll just throw these back and forth to you. Either one of you feel free to answer. So the first question we have is, when transportation raises concerns before a board vote and the vote passes anyway, how do you manage the fallout and still be seen as a partner? So how do you react to that?
I think Jim actually did a great job of just talking about that a moment ago, which was to say, if you're not going to win all the time, and if you've participated and you have provided the information, ultimately your responsibility is to go implement. And I think the requirement at that point is being able to take what you've learned from the redistricting process and then explain to leadership, explain to the public what the challenges of implementation are going to be. So if it's going to be longer ride times, for example, don't keep that a secret. That strikes me as something you should get out there ahead of time. If it's going to require more money, get that out there ahead of time. So I think it's once the decision's been made, the decision's been made, and your job is to go implement, so go implement.
Okay, great. Good answer to that. All right, let's take another question here. What's the first piece of data a transportation director should bring to the superintendent when a closure is being discussed? So we've talked about a lot of data points here. It could be a little overwhelming, but what would you say is the first piece that we need to bring to the discussion?
So I will share this. When you're dealing with a school board, I learned this the hard way, I guess. There's a couple of things that I would say that you need to do. And that first is how you communicate with the school board. One is, I work for a guy that says, be brief, be bright, be gone, okay? And so I keep it concise, keep it short, keep it simple, keep it to a one-page impact of what that's going to look like. How's it going to impact your routing, your operations, your other staff, and all those other items? So collectively as a staff, before you ever get to the point, you need to identify that in a format that says, here's the impacts. And then if they have a discussion about ABC school, now you can immediately go and start filling those in. You can be prepared in a one page. The last thing I'll say, and this is a little touchy, but write it in such a way that a middle schooler would understand it. Because a lot of times, we had folks that really tried to get into the weeds as far as data, acronyms, things, and it was and the board just didn't understand, they didn't comprehend, because they are not a part of our world. School board members, and education is known for its acronyms. And so one of the things that we need to do is talk to an audience that doesn't understand transportation, that doesn't understand how we work and how it's going to be an impact. And so those are the two pieces of advice I would give.
Yeah, and I think related to that, and I don't say this nearly as callously as it's going to sound, but figure out if you care, right? If it's two neighborhood schools that are being consolidated and it's not going to have a transportation impact, don't be afraid to say that. Don't be afraid to say, hey, this isn't a me thing. The impact on me is pretty negligible, so have at it. And, give yourself a couple of free Tuesday nights at that point.
Okay, great. Well, guys, I appreciate this conversation. I think this has been super helpful for folks. The bottom line is really clear here is that school closures, redistricting, it's just a reality for today's K-12 districts. We've talked so much about, vouchers and charter schools and changes in population. It's just inevitable. But we have learned today that the closure catastrophes are really preventable in the main way. It is whether transportation helps shape those decisions or plays catch up after them. We want to be on the front end of that, right? We want to have the right data to bring to the table. We want to be having the right conversations and not be reactive. And so one thing I want to say is really when directors use modern routing software to model scenarios before the vote, they can really have a realistic view of what that looks like. What impact is that going to have on transportation? I'll just say our sandbox capability we have in easy routing is phenomenal because it allows you to take a set of students and say, okay, what happens if we change the boundaries? What does that do to our student population? What does it do to the number of buses we need? And so you really need that capability in some form or fashion going into these discussions to be able to model that data. And really the ability to do that, to model those scenarios before a vote is taken on this kind of action is, we're protecting kids, protecting the teams, protecting the district, right? I mean, it's all inclusive here, and we appreciate the great discussion on this. We would love to talk to you about how easy routing can help in this scenario. We'd love to do a one-on-one with any of you who would like to see this to understand what we mean by sandbox and modeling those scenarios and how sophisticated software can make that really easy to do, to play out multiple scenarios and the impacts of that on transportation. If you'd like to, visit us at www.pathwise.com. We'd love to talk with you, schedule some one-on-one time and help talk through some of these scenarios with you. And of course, you can always find great, valuable resources from schoolbusfleet.com as well. We appreciate the time that they've allowed us to have here with you today. So feel free, go on our website, schedule a demo or schedule a conversation. Reach out to us. We appreciate the time today. And Tim and Jim, you guys have been great. Your experience of years of dealing with this comes through, and you've given us some great advice for our folks here today, and we appreciate that. So thank you for attending, and we appreciate your time. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.